A distant ship smoke on the horizon.
Most people think the toughest moments in a musician's career come from clashing egos, label politics, or the pressure to write a hit. But for David Gilmour, the most difficult recordings of his entire life didn't come from fame, money, or even Pink Floyd's internal wars. They came from something far more personal, an emotional storm tied to loyalty, guilt, and a friend he never stopped caring about. Because long before the headlines, long before the lawsuits, and long before Pink Floyd became a battlefield for clashing visions, there was a bond that held everything together. A friendship so deep that, when it finally began to break, it left scars across every person involved. And in the middle of that unraveling stood one musician whose talent once shaped the entire direction of the band, but whose world was slipping away faster than anyone knew how to handle. Gilmour didn't talk about those sessions often, but when he did, a single word kept resurfacing: nightmare. Not out of anger, not out of regret, but out of the sheer emotional weight of what he walked into. These weren't normal studio problems. These were moments where music collided with reality,
Distant ship smoke on the horizon.
where genius tangled with instability, and where every take felt like a struggle between the past and the present. And the deeper Gilmour went, the harder it became to know whether he was helping to save a friend or watching the last pieces of him drift away. But the story behind those recordings reveals something most fans never hear: the part of Pink Floyd's legacy built not on conflict, but on compassion. And what happened inside that studio would change how Gilmour looked at music, friendship, and responsibility for the rest of his life. The bond with Syd Barrett. Before Pink Floyd became a global machine of precision and spectacle, its heart was something much smaller, almost fragile. A group of friends trying to turn their imaginations into sound. At the center of that early spark stood Syd Barrett, and no one felt that spark more deeply than David Gilmour. They weren't just bandmates. They were teenagers growing up in the same circles, sharing jokes, ideas, and the kind of musical curiosity that only comes when you're young and convinced the world is waiting for you. Gilmour always described Syd with a warmth that never faded. He talked about him being effortlessly magnetic, funny, sharp, and almost impossible not to like. There was a brightness to Syd, something that drew people in before he even picked up a guitar. And when he did pick one up, that charm turned into something electric. To Gilmour, Syd wasn't just talented. He was different, original in a way most artists try their whole lives to be. What made their connection so intense was how naturally they understood each other. They both loved experimenting, both had the kind of creative instincts you couldn't teach, and both were captivated by the idea of making music that didn't sound like anything else. It wasn't surprising that, when Syd helped push Pink Floyd into the spotlight, Gilmour was one of the first people cheering him on. But friendships built in youth carry a certain weight, one that doesn't disappear when things start to change. And as Pink Floyd grew, something else grew with it. A slow, unsettling shift in Syd's behavior that none of his friends could ignore. The same mind that once lit the room was becoming harder to understand, harder to hold on to, and harder for Gilmour to watch. Because when you've known someone since the days before fame, before pressure, before the world was watching, seeing that person begin to slip away doesn't feel like a band problem. Feels like losing a piece of your own past. And for Gilmour, that was only the beginning. The collapse of Pink Floyd's early leader. As Pink Floyd's audience grew, Syd's grip on reality began to slip in ways nobody around him could fully process. At first, it looked like quirks, moments where he'd drift off mid-conversation or lose focus during rehearsals. But those small cracks widened fast. The same creative fearlessness that once made him brilliant now twisted into unpredictability that scared the people who loved him most. Inside the studio, it became painfully clear something was wrong. Some days Syd showed up ready to work. Other days he barely spoke at all. There were moments when he'd stare into space, completely detached, as if the world around him had suddenly gone silent. And when they did get him in front of a microphone, nobody knew what would happen next. Songs changed shape mid-performance. Chords faded into nothing. Entire verses vanished or reappeared in different forms. Roger Waters later admitted how intense those moments became. He said the tension got so high that anyone in the band felt like they could tear his throat out at any second. Not out of hatred, but frustration mixed with fear, confusion, and sadness they didn't know how to deal with. They weren't watching a musician lose focus. They were watching a friend lose parts of himself. Still, nobody wanted to make the final call. Pink Floyd didn't fire Sid in a dramatic showdown. Instead, they stopped picking him up for rehearsals. They began playing shows without him, waiting to see if he'd even notice. And the unsettling truth was that for a while, he didn't. He drifted through those months in a haze, half aware that something had changed but unable to grasp the full picture. By 1968, the band had quietly moved on without him. And yet, the ghost of that decision lingered heavily over everyone, especially Gilmour. He hadn't just stepped into Sid's spot. He had stepped into the space left by someone he'd grown up with, admired, and cared for long before the band had a following. It wasn't victory. It felt like betrayal wrapped in necessity. But what none of them expected was that Sid still wanted to make music. And that desire would pull Gilmour back into a situation far more emotional and far more chaotic than anything that had happened inside Pink Floyd. Gilmour's decision to help Sid solo. After Sid drifted out of Pink Floyd, most people assumed he was done with music. His behavior had become too unpredictable, too fragile, too far removed from the structured world a band needed to function. But beneath all of that chaos, Sid still had the spark that had defined him from the start. He wanted to keep creating. He wanted to record, and he reached for the one person who wouldn't turn away. David Gilmour didn't hesitate. All the mixed emotions he'd been carrying, guilt for stepping into Sid's role, sadness over what he'd watched happen, and a lingering hope that maybe things could still be salvaged, pulled him straight back into Sid's orbit. Helping him make a solo album wasn't a business decision. It wasn't a career move. It was personal, almost like an unspoken promise he felt obligated to honor. Gilmour knew it wouldn't be easy. Everyone around him knew it wouldn't be easy. Sid's state had only become more unpredictable since leaving the band. But that didn't matter. To Gilmour, this was someone he had grown up with, someone he admired long before Pink Floyd had a name. And when a friend you love is slipping, you don't calculate the risks. You try to catch whatever pieces you can. So when Sid walked back into the studio in 1970, asking for help finishing what would become the Madcap Laughs and Barrett,
I really love you, and I mean you.
Gilmour stepped in without hesitation. He wasn't just producing. He was protecting a friend's last connection to the world that once embraced him. There was a quiet sense of duty in every move he made, as if he knew these sessions were more than recordings. They were a fragile attempt to preserve what was left of Sid's artistry. But nothing could have prepared Gilmour for what those sessions would actually look like. The unpredictability he'd seen in Pink Floyd was only a glimpse of what was coming. And once the tape started rolling, he found himself in a situation no producer, no friend, and no musician could ever truly be ready for. The nightmare recording process. The moment the recording sessions began, Gilmour realized he'd stepped into something unlike any studio experience he'd ever known. Nothing followed a pattern. Nothing could be predicted. Every second depended entirely on where Sid's mind happened to be in that exact moment. And for a musician trained on precision and structure, it felt like trying to navigate a maze that kept rearranging itself. Sid insisted on recording live takes first, just him, a guitar, and whatever rhythm happened to come out. But his timing wasn't just loose, it was constantly shifting. He'd pause in the middle of a chord for no clear reason, then jump back in at a completely different tempo. Some lines rushed forward, others lagged behind, and sometimes he drifted into a completely new melody without warning. To anyone else, it might have sounded like mistakes. To Gilmour, it was a reminder of how far Sid had slipped from the artist he once was. After each take, the real struggle began. Gilmour and the other musicians had to build the entire track around Sid's unpredictable performance. It was like trying to put walls around a house with no foundation. Every bar changed shape, every measure was uneven, and no two takes matched. Billy Corgan once recalled Gilmour calling the process a nightmare, not out of cruelty, but out of the sheer impossibility of the task. You can rehearse for anything, but you can't rehearse for chaos. The hardest part wasn't the technical challenge. It was the emotional hit. Gilmour could see the flashes of the old Sid, moments where a lyric sounded sharp or a melody slipped into something beautiful, but they vanished as quickly as they appeared. One take might feel promising, only for the next to collapse into a string of disjointed phrases. It wasn't just inconsistency, it was instability, raw and unfiltered. And through it all, Sid didn't seem to understand why the sessions were so difficult. To him, everything he played was simply what he felt in the moment. There was no structure to return to, no version to replicate. Every performance was a one-time expression, gone the instant it was recorded. For Gilmour, this wasn't just a challenging album. It was watching a friend drift in and out of clarity, the music becoming a window into a mind struggling to stay connected. And as the takes piled up, one thing became painfully obvious. The real battle wasn't musical. It was emotional. But the music itself would become even more unpredictable. Because Sid's guitar wasn't the only thing changing from moment to moment. Lyrics that changed every take. If the music was unpredictable, the lyrics were something else entirely. Gilmour had expected some inconsistencies. After all, Sid's behavior had been erratic for years, but nothing prepared him for what happened once Sid stepped up to the microphone. It wasn't just that he forgot lines or sang the wrong verse. He reinvented the words every single time, as if each take existed in its own universe. One moment he'd deliver a line with sharp clarity, full of imagery and wordplay only he could create. Then, on the very next take, the same line would twist into something completely different, new words, new phrasing, sometimes new meanings altogether. It wasn't improvisation in the usual sense. It felt more like Sid's thoughts were scattering faster than he could catch them, leaving fragments behind instead of finished ideas. Gilmour later admitted he often had no idea what Sid was saying. Even when they played the tapes back, pieces of the lyrics were so mumbled, drifted, or unexpectedly altered that it was nearly impossible to decipher what he'd intended. And things got even more complicated when Sid double-tracked his vocals. Normally, double-tracking creates a fuller, richer sound. But Sid didn't repeat the same lines. He wasn't even consistent with the same words. One vocal line might drift toward whimsy, while the second took a darker, more cryptic turn. Nowhere was this more obvious than on Octopus.
An echo for your way.
The album's title itself comes from a lyric that Sid sometimes sang as "The Madcap Laughs," but on other takes, he changed it to "The Mad Cat Laughs," shifting the meaning entirely with a single letter. It wasn't a deliberate artistic choice. It was simply how his mind was working at the time. Fluid, unstable, constantly rewriting itself. For Gilmour, it was heartbreaking. These weren't the whimsical experiments of a creative genius pushing boundaries. They were glimpses into a mind slipping out of sync with itself. Each take felt like a message from a different version of Sid, each one drifting a little further from the person Gilmour had grown up with. Yet somehow, buried in all that disorder, there was a strange beauty, raw, haunting, and unlike anything else coming out of the music scene at the time. The unpredictability became part of the album's character, a reflection of Sid's internal world rather than a flaw in the recording process. But what emerged from that chaos would surprise everyone who heard it. The albums become strangely beautiful. As the sessions dragged on, something unexpected began to surface, something that even Gilmour hadn't anticipated. Beneath all the uneven timing, the shifting lyrics, and the heavy sense of instability, the songs started taking on a life of their own. They didn't sound polished or controlled or remotely conventional, but they carried a kind of fragile beauty that couldn't have been created any other way. The rawness became the point. Every unpredictable pause, every wandering chord, every line Sid delivered differently from the one before. It all formed a portrait of a mind caught between brilliance and collapse. These weren't songs built with the usual studio precision. They felt more like emotional snapshots, pieces of Sid's drifting consciousness preserved at the exact moment they passed through him. Gilmour and the other musicians didn't just tolerate the chaos. They shaped it. They found ways to wrap gentle instrumentation around Sid's shaky timing, adding just enough structure to hold the songs together without crushing the strange charm inside them. It was less about producing a record and more about protecting the fragile spirit behind it. Every overdub, every careful decision in the mixing room became an act of preservation. And somehow, what came out of that process were albums unlike anything else in rock music. The Madcap Laughs and Barrett didn't sound like products of the early 1970s. They sounded timeless, eerie, intimate, like a private diary accidentally left open for the world to read. Sid's voice wavered, his guitar drifted, his words tangled into knots. Yet the honesty in every moment made the imperfections feel intentional, even poetic. Listeners who later discovered these albums found themselves pulled into their strange gravity. The music felt both unsettling and beautiful, a reminder that creativity doesn't always come from clarity or control. Sometimes it emerges from the edges, from the places where everything is falling apart. And the more you listened, the more you felt like you were hearing the last glowing embers of someone who had once burned incredibly bright. For Gilmour, there must have been a bittersweet pride in that. He had helped turn chaos into something meaningful, something that honored the friend he remembered even as he faced the painful reality of who Sid had become. And he knew the emotional cost was far higher than anything that appeared in the credits. But finishing the albums didn't end the story. The weight of those sessions and the memory of the friend he fought so hard to help would stay with Gilmour long after the final tapes stopped rolling. Legacy and emotional weight. When the recordings finally wrapped, there was no celebration, no victory lap, no sense of closure. Gilmour walked away from the sessions with a heaviness he rarely talked about, an emotional weight that didn't fade with time. Because those albums weren't just pieces of music. They were a record of a friendship tested by reality, loyalty pushed to its breaking point, and a quiet grief that never truly settled. Sid didn't return to the spotlight the way some hoped he would. The albums came out, listeners were stunned by their fragile brilliance, and then Sid slipped further into his private world. And while the public slowly formed their own interpretations of his genius and decline, Gilmour carried a different memory of those days, one built on years of knowing the person behind the myth. Every interview he gave about those sessions carried the same undertone. Love, mixed with sadness. He never spoke about Sid with blame, and he never framed the experience as a burden. Instead, he talked about the friend who had once lit up every room, the teenager he joked with long before fame meant anything, and the artist whose imagination had inspired an entire generation of musicians. But the hardest part was knowing the man who created Pink Floyd's earliest magic would never fully return. That realization stayed with Gilmour through every era of the band, through the conflicts, the tours, the success, and the widening distance between the remaining members. Because no matter how complicated Pink Floyd became, Sid was always a reminder of what the band was before the pressure, before the fame, before everything fractured. The legacy of the Madcap Laughs and Barrett became something almost sacred. Not polished masterpieces, but intimate fragments of a mind in freefall, held together by friends who refused to let those final sparks disappear. And for Gilmour, the emotional cost of making those records became part of his own story, shaping how he saw music, responsibility, and the fragile line between brilliance and struggle. Even decades later, when fans asked about those sessions, his voice softened, because the scars of that experience never fully healed. They weren't meant to. What happened in that studio didn't just change Sid's legacy. It changed Gilmour forever. Thought-provoking close. The story of those albums isn't just about music. It's about friendship, loyalty, and the quiet sacrifices that often go unnoticed behind the scenes. Gilmour didn't step into the studio to create a hit. He stepped in to preserve a friend, to honor a talent slipping away, and to transform chaos into something meaningful. And in doing so, he left behind more than songs. He left a testament to what it means to care, even when the odds are impossible. The Madcap Laughs and Barrett may never have been commercially perfect. They may never have followed the polished formulas that make records timeless in a conventional sense. But their beauty lies in imperfection, in vulnerability, in unpredictability, and in the raw humanity of a mind that refused to conform. Every warped chord, every shifting lyric, every fleeting moment of clarity tells a story of genius intertwined with fragility. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. The moments that are hardest, the people who challenge us, and the experiences that push us to our limits often leave the deepest marks. They remind us that art isn't just about talent or technique. It's about connection, empathy, and the courage to see someone through their darkest moments. So the next time you listen to those albums, remember more than the music. Remember the friendship behind it, the patience it demanded, and the extraordinary effort it took to turn a nightmare into something hauntingly beautiful. Because what Gilmour and his friends achieved in those sessions wasn't just a record. It was a quiet act of devotion that still resonates decades later. And perhaps the most haunting question of all lingers in the silence between the notes. Were these albums a final gift from Syd Barrett, or a glimpse of a genius slipping through our fingers, caught forever in music that refuses to be tamed?